everyone, my name is Judy Perry and I'm a laboratory demonstrator here at the Marine Institute. And we are in the primary chemistry lab of the Marine Institute. It's E1321. It's used mainly for our first year chemistry labs, but there are some other courses in other programs that take place in here as well. So today we're going to do a safety introduction. So I'm going to show you some of the safety features of the lab and talk about some of the hazards that you should be aware of when you're working in a chemistry lab. So at this point you should have already completed Laboratory Safety and WHMIS online, Science 1807 and 1808. If you have not, now would be a good place to start. You can go back and do those and come back to this video later. So make sure you've done that before you start this video. So we're going to start by talking about personal safety in terms of PPE, personal protective equipment, and what you should be wearing anytime you're working in a laboratory. So one of the main things that you need to have in terms of PPE are safety glasses, appropriate approved safety glasses, as I'm wearing here now. You also need to have a lab coat anytime you're working in the lab. Any clothing that you're wearing, I wouldn't recommend wearing your best clothing to a chemistry lab, because even though you are wearing a lab coat, there's always a risk that you could get chemicals on your lab coat, on your clothing, sorry, that could ruin it. So you want to make sure you wear clothing that if it gets damaged, it's not going to be too important. You also want to make sure that your clothing covers any exposed skin. So things like shorts or skirts are not permitted into the laboratory. When it comes to footwear, you want to make sure you're wearing footwear that covers the entire foot. So sandals or open-toed shoes would not be permitted as well. If you have long hair, often in the lab we're working with flames or we're leaning over working with chemicals. So if you have long hair, you want to make sure it's tied back so it doesn't get in the way or risk catching on fire. Hats are not permitted in the lab, so ball caps or any other type of hat are not permitted as well, again due to the fire hazard. The main ways that chemicals can enter your body in a chemistry lab are through your skin, which is the reason why we wear appropriate lab coat, through your eyes, which is why we wear, of course, the eye protection, and through your mouth. So I'd also like to recommend that anytime you're in the lab, you don't chew gum, because that could ingest chemicals into your body. I also recommend never putting anything in your mouth in a lab. People have a lot of habits of chewing on pens, chewing on their fingers, anything like that. So make sure you don't put anything in your mouth when you're in a laboratory. Okay. So now I'd like to take you through the lab and point out some of the important safety features of the lab and some of the things that you need to be aware of. So we'll start with the exits. The exit that we usually mainly use to come into the lab is right here. This would exit out into the hallway, so that's our main emergency exit. There are also two exits here and down in the back of the lab, and they go into the lab next door. So if there happens to be a fire in this lab, you can exit into the other lab. We also have windows as a last resort. If there's no other way out, we can always exit through the windows if we need it. We come back over to this area. We can see there's an eye wash station right here. So this works simply by pushing down on the handle, and you don't even need to take off the cover. The force of the water will push the cover off. So if you spill something or something splashes into your eyes, you can use the eye wash station to rinse it out. Make sure you take off your safety goggles first, of course. Also over here we have a glass disposal box for broken glass. We're working with a lot of glassware in the lab, and that's the main source of cuts in the lab. So anytime you're dealing with glass, if it's broken, you want to make sure it's disposed of properly. So we have a little broom and dustpan. You can clean up your glass, dump it into this box, and it will be disposed of properly. Over here behind me, you can see there's a fire blanket. So in case of a fire, if you have a fire on your clothing, you can open this, pull out this blanket, and wrap yourself up in it. You'll notice that as I'm wrapping myself, you want to keep it tight around your neck because you don't want to create a funnel effect and have flames coming up and burning your face. So you want to keep it tight around your neck, and that's designed to put out any fires that may be on your clothing. Put that away later. Moving down through the lab, right here we have a fire extinguisher. There are numerous fire extinguishers in this lab. They're mainly in the four corners of the lab, and they are all ABC class, which covers most of the chemical or fire hazards that we would encounter in this lab. We move down through. Down here you'll see a mercury spill kit. Now most of the thermometers that we use in this lab are alcohol based and are not mercury, so hopefully you won't encounter a spill, but in case it does happen, there is our mercury spill kit which will allow you to safely clear that up. Located right here underneath the spill kit is the propane emergency shutoff. Generally you will also not need to use that. Generally your instructor or your demonstrator will shut off the propane if they need to, but just so you know where it is in case of an emergency. Down here, you'll see we have another fire extinguisher. Again, the same class as the other one. We have a first aid kit. There's a sign behind it that tells you exactly what its contents are. It has things like gauze and bandages and gloves that you could use in the event of an accident. Anytime you do have an accident in the lab, no matter how minor it is, even if it's just a paper cut, you always want to make sure you tell your instructor or your demonstrator, because there's always a possibility that something could become contaminated. Maybe it's not an issue now, but it might become an issue later. So you want to make sure there's a record of that in case anything happens. So make sure any accidents are reported to your instructor or demonstrator. Right here we have our spill kits. So we have one for acids and bases, because acids and bases are the most common chemicals that we use in this lab. So this kit, one for acids, one for bases. It will provide all the equipment that you need to clean up any spill, and of course anytime you spill anything, you also want to report that to your instructor and demonstrator as well. Down here, across the back of the lab, you'll see we have a number of these fume hoods. So anytime we're using a chemical that may give off vapors or volatile vapors that could be hazardous, we will work in the fume hood. You'll notice that there's little arrows on the side of the fume hood, and they indicate where this sash should be. So you notice this can move up or down, so you want to have it at least at that arrow, not above. If it's above the arrow, it's not effective. So if you're working with anything in the fume hood, you make sure you keep it in, keep your hands in the fume hood, and keep the chemical inside the fume hood. There's a bottle here. I just want to point out, since you've already done the course on WHMIS, WHMIS labeling is important. You want to make sure you're very familiar with the pictograms. Anytime there's chemicals out in the lab, if it's not a supplier chemical, if it's a prepared chemical, it will have a workplace label, and that will include things like the product name, any safety hazards that are associated with it, which is usually indicated by those pictograms, and it'll have reference to the STS sheets as well. Okay, so you want to make sure you're familiar with WHMIS and how to read labels properly. One other piece of safety equipment that we have here is the safety shower. And this is used mainly for large spills. So if you have spills on your clothing that you can't just wash off, or you can't just take your lab coat off, you can stand under this, pull the lever, and a large volume of water will be dispensed to help you wash off any chemical spills. Just want to point out, now we're down here towards the back of the lab, you can see the computer over here behind me. I mentioned SDS sheets, safety data sheets. Those are available for any of the chemicals that you may be working with in the lab. So anytime you're working with a chemical you're not aware of its hazards, you can always go back there on that computer and check. There's a database that contains SDS for all of the chemicals that we'll be using in the laboratory. So it's always a good idea that you're familiar with the SDS, how they work, what information they contain, and of course where to access them. So that covers the basic info, and this is supplementary to the info that you should have already covered in lab safety and WHMIS. So thank you for watching. Chemistry labs, I like to think the best part of doing a chemistry course is the ability to work in a lab and do fun experiments, but of course the main thing is that we always do everything safely. So thanks for watching.